By the time the wedding bells rang across the frozen frontier that morning, Lydia was already shaking. Not from cold, not from nerves, but from the bruise hidden beneath her veil. A bruise she didn't give herself. A bruise that would change everything. Everyone in town said she was lucky to marry Walter Kane, the wealthy rancher feared across 3 counties. But no one questioned why she refused to lift her veil. No one questioned the way she limped. And no one questioned why Walter's brother stood in the back of the church, watching her like a man ready to burn the world down. This story you're about to hear is one of the most shocking frontier romances ever whispered across the Old West. A tale of 2 brothers, 1 woman, and a choice that would cost a man his life. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. All right, let's begin. The town of Copper Ridge sat at the edge of nowhere, 5 miles from the nearest railroad, 20 miles from the closest town with a real doctor, 100 miles from anything that resembled civilization. It was October 1887, and the first snow was already falling. Copper Ridge existed because of one man, Walter Kane. 10 years ago, he'd come to this stretch of frozen land with nothing but a rifle and a dream of building an empire. By sheer force of will, and some methods that didn't bear close examination, he'd carved out a ranch that stretched across 15,000 acres. He'd dug wells, built barns, hired men through fear, and paid them through obligation. The town grew up around his ranch like a parasite feeding on a host. The general store belonged to Walter. The bank belonged to Walter. The church, well, Walter had donated the land. So in a very real sense, even God's house in Copper Ridge was his. And now, on this frozen October morning, Walter Kane was getting married. The townsfolk gathered in the church out of obligation. Not joy, not celebration, obligation. Because when Walter Kane commanded something, people obeyed. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. 3 weeks earlier, in a small office above the bank, Lydia's father had sat across from Walter Kane and learned the true price of desperation. His name was James Hartwell. Once he'd owned land, good land, productive land, 200 acres of prairie that could feed a family and generate income for life. But James had never been good with money. Bad investments, poor harvests, a wife who died and took his will to succeed with her. By the time Lydia turned 18, James owed more money than he would ever make in his lifetime. He owed it to the bank, which was owned by Walter Kane. Walter had been patient. For almost 2 years he'd let James struggle, make payments, miss payments, spiral deeper into debt. Walter could afford patience, because patience was a weapon, and James was weakening. Finally, on a cold September evening, Walter had invited James to his office. "I have a solution to your problem," Walter had said, pouring whiskey neither of them needed. James had sat on the edge of a chair, his hands shaking. "Your daughter," Walter continued, "is of marriageable age." James's stomach had dropped. "I need a wife," Walter said simply. "You need forgiveness of debt. A marriage settles both matters." "Walter," James had begun, his voice cracking. "She's just a girl. She doesn't—" "She will," Walter interrupted. "Once we're married, your debt disappears. Your land is saved. Your daughter becomes the wife of the wealthiest man in 3 counties. She'll want for nothing." It wasn't a proposal, it was a transaction. And James, broken, desperate, ashamed, had said yes. Lydia had been working in the general store when her father came to tell her. She'd been organizing bolts of fabric, calicos and ginghams, the dreary colors frontier women wore, when he'd appeared in the doorway, his face the color of ash. He'd asked her to walk with him. Outside, the wind was picking up. Clouds were moving in from the north. The kind of weather that made even the bravest men nervous. "I've made an arrangement," her father had said. She'd known immediately, the way he couldn't meet her eyes, the way his voice was small and defeated, the way his hands were in his pockets, hidden, ashamed. "You're marrying Walter Kane," he'd finished. Lydia had stopped walking. The wind had caught her hair, and she'd let it whip around her face because at least the pain of it was real. "Father, no." "Yes. I barely know him." "You will learn to. He's—" She'd searched for the words. "He's cold. He's cruel. Everyone knows what he's capable of." Her father had finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face was something she'd never seen before. Complete, utter defeat. "Lydia, I owe more money than we will ever possess. The bank is going to take the land. We're going to lose everything. Your mother's memory, her legacy, the home she built. It will all vanish." He'd taken her hand, and his was shaking. "This marriage saves us. Walter forgives the debt. We keep the land. You become the wife of a powerful man. In frontier terms, that's not just survival. That's success." "What about love?" she'd whispered. Her father had looked away. "Love is a luxury," he'd said. "Survival is a necessity." And that was how Lydia had learned she was being traded like cattle at auction. But 3 days later, something changed. Lydia had been at the general store again when Elias Kane had walked through the door. She'd heard about him before, of course. Everyone in town knew that Walter had a brother, knew that Elias was dangerous in a different way than Walter, not through tyranny, but through charm, through the kind of beauty that made women foolish. He'd walked directly to where she was standing behind the counter, and he'd smiled, not the polite smile of a customer. Something warmer, something that made her feel seen. "You must be Lydia," he'd said. "I am." "I'm Elias." He'd extended his hand, and she'd shaken it. His palm was warm, calloused, but warm. "I've heard about your upcoming marriage," he'd said, still holding her hand. "To my brother." "Yes," she'd said carefully. His smile had faded slightly. "I'm sorry, for what that means." And something in the way he'd said it, like he understood, like he'd seen the cage before she was even locked inside, had made her chest ache. For 3 days, Elias had been kind to her. He'd appeared at the general store. He'd carried her parcels. He'd asked about her dreams in a way that made her think he actually cared about the answers. They'd walked to the edge of town, where the prairie opened up and you could see for miles in every direction. "You don't have to do this," he'd said on the 3rd evening. "You could leave. Tonight. I could help you." She'd wanted to. God, she'd wanted to. But she thought of her father's face, the defeat in his eyes, the way his hands shook. "I have to," she'd said. Elias's jaw had clenched. She'd seen something flash in his eyes, something dark and possessive. "Then you're mine," he'd said. "Before he even has you, you're mine." She'd pulled her hand away. "Don't talk like that. I'm serious. Come with me tonight. Not to be married, just to be free." "I can't abandon my father." Elias had grabbed her arm then, not to hurt her, but to keep her from walking away, to keep her there, to make her understand the seriousness of what he was saying. "If you marry Walter," he'd said, "he'll own you. Do you understand? He'll own your body, your time, your choices. He'll own you the way he owns the land and the water and the town. And I won't be able to save you once he does." She'd twisted away from his grip, and his hand had caught her cheekbone. Not a punch. An accident born from desperation and struggle. The bruise had bloomed within hours, and it had darkened over 2 days into something that looked undeniably like violence. The morning of the wedding, Lydia had woken to find Walter Kane standing in her family's parlor. Her father had been pale, apologetic, terrified. Walter had brought a gift, a veil. Not just any veil, a full, ornate piece of lace that covered the entire face. Expensive. The kind of veil that a woman being married off for debt might appreciate as camouflage. "For you," Walter had said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. She'd understood immediately. He knew about the bruise. More than that, he'd seen it and decided it didn't matter. He was going to cover it, make it his secret, control the narrative before it even formed. This was his power, not just the ability to take what he wanted, but to make the world accept his version of reality. The church was packed. Every member of Copper Ridge had come, not out of joy for the bride and groom, but out of fear of Walter Kane and the implicit threat that absence would be noted and remembered. The pews groaned under the weight of the townsfolk. Walter stood at the altar, tall, broad, shoulders squared like a man who owned the air he breathed and every creature that drew it. He didn't smile. He never did. His eyes scanned the church with the cold calculation of someone counting his possessions, assessing their value, determining which ones might need breaking. When his gaze landed on Lydia's father, there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a debt settled, a transaction finalized. The pastor began the ceremony with a nervous voice. Everyone could feel the weight in the room. This wasn't a wedding. It was a coronation, a claiming. Walter's hand rested on the altar, not open, not waiting, claiming. His men stood scattered throughout the church, not guests but guards. They wore their gun belts openly. They carried rifles. They positioned themselves at exits and near the back. No one dared speak above a whisper. The pastor's voice wavered as he read the vows. Even he could feel it. This marriage wasn't happening because two people loved each other. It was happening because one man had decided it would. When Lydia walked down the aisle, her father's arm barely supporting her, the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath. She was a ghost in white, a woman being married, not to a husband, but to her fate. But in the back pew, Elias Kane watched every moment. He was Walter's younger brother, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a face that made women stare too long and men nervous they might lose theirs. He smiled when Walter didn't. He moved with a grace his brother had abandoned years ago for the brutal efficiency of power. But beneath that charm was something harder, something that had been watching this moment for months, waiting, planning. He'd known about Walter's marriage plan before Lydia's father did. Walter had discussed it over brandy one night, laying out the logic like a business deal. "I need a wife," Walter had said. "Not for companionship, for leverage, for an heir, for the appearance of respectability." Elias had listened, and something had shifted in him. He'd gone to town. He'd watched Lydia at the general store. He'd seen the way she moved, with grace, but without confidence. He'd seen her eyes, intelligent, searching, trapped, and he'd made a decision. He was going to save her, or he was going to burn down his brother's empire trying. Now, sitting in the back pew, he watched as Walter claimed her. He watched the pastor's voice shake. He watched Lydia's father struggle to let her go. And he watched Walter's face, utterly unmoved, utterly certain. When Lydia's eyes lifted, just for a second, and found his in the shadows, Elias leaned forward. He didn't look away. Neither did she. For one brief moment, across the full length of the church, their eyes met. And in that moment she understood. There was another choice. It would be dangerous. It would be destructive. It would cost her everything familiar. But it existed. 3 days before the wedding, everything had escalated. Lydia's father had taken the marriage news harder than she'd expected. Oh, he'd agreed to it. He'd made the deal with Walter. But something about it had broken him. He'd started drinking. Not the social drinking of a man at a saloon. The desperate drinking of a man trying to drown the fact that he'd sold his daughter. On the night before the wedding, he'd come home drunk and furious. "Why won't you be grateful?" he'd screamed at her. "I've given you everything. I've saved our family. And you look at me like I'm a monster." "Father, don't," he'd hissed. "Don't patronize me. You think I'm happy about this? You think I wanted to marry you off to a man like Walter? I did this for you. For us. For our survival." He'd grabbed her arm and his grip was vicious. Not calculated like Walter's would be. Just desperate, drunk, broken. "You will marry him tomorrow," he'd said. "And you will smile. And you will give him sons. And you will never, never make me regret this." She'd pulled away, and he'd struck out at her, not with a closed fist, but with an open hand that caught her across the face with startling force. She'd fallen backward, and her cheekbone had hit the corner of a side table. That was when the bruise had started forming. Blood had trickled from where her skin split. She'd stood there in shock, touching her face, feeling the warmth of her own blood. And her father had, slowly, horribly, sobered up. "Lydia," he'd whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Don't," she'd said. "Just don't." Later that night, she'd been alone in her room, pressing a cold cloth to her swelling face, when she'd heard the sound of breaking glass. Her window had shattered. She'd screamed, a reflexive, terrified sound. Elias had come through the window like something out of a nightmare or a dream, depending on your perspective. "Lydia, it's me," he'd hissed. "Don't scream. Your father, is he still conscious? What are you doing here?" "Saving you. Get your things. We're leaving." She'd backed away. "Elias, you can't just—" "Walter told me what happened," he'd said, his eyes locked on her bruised face. "He's known this whole time. He's been waiting to see if you'd run. He's prepared to hunt you down if you try." "How do you know that?" "Because I know my brother." Voices had come from downstairs. Her father, stirring, confused. Elias had grabbed her hand. "We have to go. Now." She'd hesitated, that crucial, fatal hesitation, and her father had come stumbling up the stairs, rifle in hand, ready to defend against what he thought was a threat to his daughter. Elias had turned, hands raised, trying to de-escalate. But her father, drunk, terrified, ashamed, had raised the rifle. And in the struggle that followed, when Lydia had tried to get between them, her face had caught Elias's hand as she twisted away. It wasn't a punch. It was an accident born from chaos and desperation and the collision of two men's obsession with owning her. "You may lift the veil," the pastor said. His voice was thin, uncertain. The entire church held its breath. Walter moved toward Lydia with slow, heavy hands, hands that had broken men and bent the world to his will. His expression was serene, confident. He'd bought her. The veil was just ceremony. The veil rose, and the bruise appeared, purple dark, unmistakable, shaped by fingers that weren't Walter's. The gas started quietly and grew louder. The entire church erupted in hushed, shocked whispers. Women covered their mouths. Men exchanged meaningful glances. The pastor's face went pale. Walter froze. For a moment, just a moment, his expression didn't change. He stood with the veil still in his hands, looking at the bruise on his bride's face. Then his jaw clenched. His eyes darkened. His breathing became audible, deep, controlled, dangerous. But it wasn't shock. It wasn't concern. It was rage, and not at Lydia. At whoever had dared mark what he'd claimed. His gaze swept the church, not looking at Lydia, but looking for answers. Looking for the man who dared touch his property. And in the back row, Elias leaned forward, smirking. He wanted Walter to know. He wanted the war that was coming. He wanted Lydia to understand, in that moment, that her choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between different kinds of danger. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was on her side. The wedding feast was held in the largest room of the church, a space usually reserved for socials and community gatherings, now transformed into Walter's domain. Long tables were laden with food, roasted meats, breads, vegetables, preserves that the town's women had spent weeks preparing, hoping to impress the groom. None of it would be eaten. Instead, the feast became a study in barely controlled violence. Walter sat at the head of the main table, Lydia to his right. His hand never left the table knife. He turned it over and over, the blade catching the candlelight, turning it into small flashes of reflected fire. His men stood closer than normal, not sitting, but standing, positioned around the room with their hands near their weapons. The townspeople ate quietly, trying not to draw attention, sensing the storm building. Lydia sat frozen, her untouched plate before her. She'd tried to eat. Her throat wouldn't cooperate. Halfway through the meal, Walter leaned in close. His voice was soft, terrifyingly soft. "Tell me who hurt you." It wasn't a question. She hesitated, just long enough for him to know she was lying, that she would lie if given the chance, that she was capable of deception. Walter's nostrils flared. He stood abruptly, his chair slamming backward with enough force to echo through the room. The music died. The conversation stopped. Everyone watched as Walter crossed the room in 3 powerful strides to where Elias sat with 2 ranch hands. "Did you touch her?" Walter demanded, his voice low and lethal. Elias stood slowly, a smile playing at his lips. "Brother," he said quietly. "Congratulations. She came to me 3 nights ago, begged me to run away with her. Perhaps if you'd been less concerned with counting your cattle and more concerned with earning your bride's affection, she wouldn't have needed comfort." It was a lie, a strategic, devastating lie. Walter's fist came up. Elias sidestepped it, barely, and the punch connected with the wooden beam behind him, cracking the wood audibly. Men shouted. Elias threw a punch of his own, fast, brutal, accurate. It caught Walter in the jaw, snapping his head back. And suddenly, the feast exploded into violence. Chairs crashed in all directions. Men threw fists at men who'd done nothing wrong, caught up in the contagion of violence. Glasses shattered. Food went flying. The women screamed. Walter's men began to move in on Elias, but he was fast, desperate, fighting like a man who had nothing to lose. And in the chaos, with the attention of the room focused on the 2 brothers destroying each other, Lydia lifted her skirts and ran. She didn't look back. She ran into the snow, away from the violence, away from the men who wanted to own her, into the cold that was at least honest about its danger. The blizzard was thickening. Her thin boots, delicate, expensive things that Walter had bought for the wedding, sank into drifts that were already past her ankles. Her white dress became soaked with snow and mud. The cold was beyond anything she'd experienced, not just cold, but penetrating, the kind of cold that found its way into your bones and made you question whether living was worth the effort. She ran until her lungs burned. She ran until her legs felt disconnected from her body. She ran until the church and the town and the only world she'd ever known were swallowed by the storm. The snow erased her footprints almost as soon as she made them. The wind screamed around her, disorienting, making it impossible to know if she was running away or running in circles. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that staying was death, not the quick death of violence, but the slow death of being owned, the slow death of becoming a thing instead of a person. The snow grew thicker. The trees, barely visible, became her landmarks, though she couldn't be sure where they were or where they led. Her hands were numb. Her face was burning and freezing simultaneously. She was sobbing, though she couldn't remember when the tears had started. She didn't see the shadow until it was too late. A hand grabbed her arm. She screamed, a primal, terrified sound that the wind immediately swallowed. She twisted, trying to break free, ready to fight. But it wasn't Walter. It wasn't her father. It was Elias. He dragged her under the porch of an abandoned cabin, out of the worst of the storm. The space was barely sheltered. The cabin was clearly long abandoned, the porch collapsing in places. But it was better than being exposed to the full force of the blizzard. Lydia was gasping, terrified, her mind cycling through possibilities of violence. "Lydia!" Elias hissed, his own breath coming hard. "Look at me. Look at me. It's me. It's Elias. You're safe." She was shaking so badly she could barely stand. "You can't go back," he continued, pulling his coat from his shoulders and wrapping it around her. "Walter's going to be in a rage. When he finds me, and he will find me, he'll kill me. And if he thinks you'll testify against me, identify me as the one who took you, he'll kill you too." "You hit me," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming and cold. Elias's hands went up, not aggressive, but pleading. "I came to save you," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. 3 nights ago, your father was beating you. I heard you screaming through your window. I broke in. Your father came at me with a rifle. I pulled you away from him to save your life, and you fought me because you thought I was just another man trying to control you." He was speaking faster now, desperate to make her understand. "You twisted away from me and fell into my hand. It was an accident. I swear to you, I was just trying to stop him from killing you both." He stepped closer, carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. "The bruise," he continued, "isn't from violence. It's from desperation. It's from me trying to save someone who was drowning." Lydia looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd grabbed her. His face was bruised from the fight. His lip was bleeding. His clothes were torn and muddy. He was terrified. But his eyes were honest. Or at least they looked honest. But Lydia had been lied to by men her entire life. Her father had lied about why she was being married. Walter had lied about wanting anything besides ownership. Elias was beautiful and charming and had come to save her, which sounded like a lie designed to make her vulnerable. How could she trust him? Yet when she didn't answer, when she just stared at him with doubt and fear in her eyes, he didn't try to convince her further. Instead, he sat down on the cabin's broken porch steps and buried his face in his hands. "I understand if you don't believe me," he said, his voice muffled. "I wouldn't believe me either, but you need shelter, and I can provide it. If that's all I can be to you right now, then that's what I'll be." And somehow, his surrender, his willingness to be doubted, was more convincing than any argument could have been. Torches flickered through the falling snow. Walter's men were hunting, fast, angry, relentless. They moved in a coordinated pattern, sweeping through the woods in a net that was slowly tightening. They had the advantage of knowing the land, of having spent years learning its secrets. Lydia and Elias crouched behind a fallen pine as voices grew closer. One man shouted to another. "If Elias touched her, Walter said bring him back dead, and if she tries to run—" The rest of the sentence was cut off by the wind, but the implication was clear. Lydia felt Elias tense beside her. For the first time, she realized he wasn't invincible. He was terrified. Not of violence itself. She sensed he'd been trained to that. That his childhood with Walter had prepared him for brutality. But he was terrified of what would happen if Walter caught them. Because Walter didn't just punish. He destroyed. He took the people you loved and made them suffer in front of you before he finally allowed you to die. "This is because of me," Lydia whispered. He shook his head. This is because Walter doesn't lose, and he believes he's lost you tonight. In his mind, you're his possession that's been stolen. And that's the only crime in Walter's world that truly matters. The voices grew closer. They crouched lower, pressing themselves against the tree, hoping the darkness and the falling snow would hide them. A rider passed within feet of their position, his torch illuminating the area, but missing them by inches. For a moment, they couldn't breathe. Then the rider moved on, and the torchlight faded. They hid in the woods until dawn. The storm continued all night, but it began to weaken as the sun approached the horizon. The wind lessened. The snow became lighter. The world began to emerge from the whiteout. Elias built a small fire with shaking hands, cold, fear, and exhaustion making him fumble with the kindling. It took him 3 attempts to get the fire started, and when it finally caught, Lydia realized he was using up their greatest resource, secrecy. A fire could be seen for miles in this white landscape, but they needed warmth, and Elias had made the calculation that freezing to death tonight was worse than being found tomorrow. They sat on opposite sides of the small fire, the heat barely reaching either of them, both wrapped in blankets that Elias had salvaged from the abandoned cabin. "There's something you need to know," Elias said, staring into the flames. "Something my brother has kept hidden for years." Lydia waited, afraid of what he would say, afraid she wouldn't believe him. "Walter didn't want a wife," Elias continued. "He wanted leverage. Your father didn't just owe him money from bad investments. He owed him everything. The land, the house, the future, every possession of value that your family had. Walter had been slowly calling in debts, tightening the noose, until your father had no choice but to make a deal." He paused, letting that sink in. "Walter offered him a choice," Elias said. "Default and lose everything, or trade his daughter. In exchange, Walter would forgive the debts and your father would keep the land." Lydia's breath caught. "So this isn't just a marriage," Elias continued. "It's a contract. You were never going to be a wife. You were always meant to be collateral. And once Walter claimed you legally, your father's debts would be forgiven, and Walter would own both of you, your father's eternal gratitude and your body." Lydia felt something inside her, some last shred of hope that her father had done this out of love, out of a desire to save the family, crumble to dust. "My father told me it was about survival," she whispered. "It was," Elias said, "but not your survival. His. He made a calculation that losing you was acceptable if it meant keeping his land and his life." Tears stung Lydia's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was done crying, done being traded like cattle, done being told which man owned her next, done accepting that this was just how life worked for women in the frontier. Something shifted inside her in that moment. Not forgiveness for her father, not trust in Elias, but clarity, pure, burning clarity that she was done being a thing to be owned, sold, or protected. She was going to make her own choices, even if those choices led to destruction, even if those choices led to death. At least they would be her choices. At sunrise, they reached the edge of the Kane ranch. The sky was clearing, pale gold light breaking through gray clouds. The snow reflected the light, making the entire world glow with an almost unreal brightness. Walter was already waiting. He stood in the ranch yard, his outline sharp against the rising sun, surrounded by armed men. 12 of them, maybe more, all carrying rifles, all waiting for orders. He'd known where they were going. Of course he had. Elias had nowhere else to go. The ranch was his home, the only place where he had resources and shelter. Walter had simply waited at the logical endpoint. "Elias, Walter called out, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. It was cold, utterly devoid of emotion. "Step away from my wife." Elias' hand moved to his gun. "Not happening, brother." But Lydia stepped forward. "No," she said. Walter's eyes narrowed. "What?" "No," she repeated, louder this time. "I won't hide any more. I won't be moved between men like furniture. I won't be owned." She pulled her hand from Elias's grasp and stood alone, between the two brothers, between two worlds. Walter's face darkened. "You think he cares for you? You think he's your savior? Look at him. He can't even protect himself, let alone you." Elias drew his gun fully now, the metal catching the morning light, turning it into a flash of reflected fire. Walter smirked, utterly unmoved. "That bruise on your face," Walter called out. "The one that was supposed to be our secret. That wasn't from you falling, was it? You hit her. You marked my property." Elias froze. Lydia's heart stopped. Walter had known all along. Of course he had. Walter always knew. Knowledge was power, and Walter had engineered this entire conversation to prove he held all of it. "And now," Walter growled, raising his rifle, "I'm going to take back what's mine, and I'm going to destroy you for touching it." He signaled his men with a slight movement of his hand. Guns lifted. The barrels pointed at both of them. A firing squad assembled, waiting only for Walter's word. For a moment, nothing moved. The entire yard held its breath. Snow settled gently around them. The sun continued its rise, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Then Lydia took a step forward, and then another. She walked toward Walter, not running, not afraid, but deliberately, powerfully. Walter lowered his rifle slightly, confused by this unexpected boldness. "Stop!" Lydia's voice cracked through the cold air like a whip. Every gun hesitated. The men looked to Walter, waiting for orders. "You have something to say, wife?" Walter asked, his tone mocking. "Yes," Lydia said, and her voice was steady. She reached back and grabbed Elias's hand, not desperately, but deliberately. A choice made consciously, in front of everyone, witnessed. "I choose neither of you." The words hung in the frozen air. Walter's jaw clenched. "You don't get to choose." "Yes," she whispered. "I do." And she meant it, not as an act of rebellion, not as a rejection, but as the most fundamental truth she'd ever spoken. She had always had a choice. She'd been told her entire life that she didn't, that women were things to be traded, that survival meant acceptance, that love, real love, was a luxury the frontier didn't permit. But standing there in the snow, between two men who wanted to own her in different ways, Lydia understood. She'd always had a choice. She'd just been too afraid to take it. Until now. Walter's eyes widened. His fury boiled over, and for a moment she saw the true monster beneath the suit and the manners. "Then you'll die with him," he snarled. He raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow. Lydia saw his finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the morning light gleam off the metal. She saw his face, utterly certain, utterly without mercy. Then Elias fired. The gunshot split the air, loud enough to make the entire yard flinch. Walter's body jerked. He looked down at the blood spreading across his chest, shock etched across his weathered face. For a moment, he stared at Lydia, really stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Not as property, not as leverage, just as a person he'd never known and would never know. Then he fell into the snow. His men stood frozen, watching their boss collapse. The morning light caught the blood spreading across the white snow, creating a terrible beauty. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, one by one, the men lowered their guns. One turned his horse around. The others followed. Within moments, the yard was quiet. Just snow. Just the three of them. Just the sound of Elias's breathing. Heavy, shocked, alive. Lydia and Elias stood together as snow settled gently around them, softening the scars of the morning. Neither of them looked at Walter's body. There would be time for that later. Time for consequences. Time for law enforcement and explanations and the slow machinery of frontier justice. But not now. Now, there was only this moment. Elias placed a careful hand on her cheek, not touching the bruise, only the space beside it. The gesture was uncertain, asking permission. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything. For that night. For putting you in danger. For—" She shook her head. "You didn't save me, and I didn't save you." She pulled his hand from her face and held it instead. Equal, not superior or subordinate. "We saved each other," she said. "That's the difference." Elias looked at their joined hands, and something shifted in his expression. It was acceptance. The understanding that he couldn't own her, couldn't protect her, couldn't claim credit for her survival. He could only walk beside her. And if he was willing to do that, truly willing, then maybe they could build something real. Not a marriage based on debt. Not a marriage based on possession, but a partnership between two people who'd seen the worst of the frontier and chosen to find something better. The townsfolk whispered for months. Some said Lydia had bewitched both Kane brothers, using dark magic and feminine wiles to turn them against each other. Some said Elias murdered Walter in cold blood over a woman who'd never love him, that he was as tyrannical as his brother, just patient enough to hide it. Some said Walter got what he deserved. A man who'd spent his life taking what didn't belong to him finally lost everything. But those who truly watched, who saw the changes in Lydia's life, knew something deeper. They saw her walk through town with her head higher than ever. They saw her laugh with her own voice instead of the laugh a man had approved. They saw her make decisions, small ones at first, then larger ones, without asking permission. They saw her hand money to her father, not out of duty, but out of choice. They saw her set boundaries with him that he respected. They saw her with Elias, and they noticed something strange. He listened more than he talked. He asked questions instead of making demands. He supported her choices even when they conflicted with his own desires. In a frontier where men owned women the way they owned cattle, this was scandalous. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change in Copper Ridge. Other women began to notice. They saw that there was an alternative to the lives their mothers had led. They saw that a man could love a woman without owning her. They saw that choices, real choices, were possible. It didn't happen overnight. Copper Ridge didn't transform into some enlightened paradise. The frontier was still brutal, still dangerous, still a place where survival often meant compromise. But there was a seed planted. In Lydia and Elias's marriage, in the way they treated each other with respect and equality, there was a seed. And seeds, once planted, are difficult to kill. 2 years later, Lydia sat on the porch of the ranch house, no longer Walter's ranch, but Elias's, and more importantly, hers. She was reading a letter from her father. He'd moved to Denver with money she'd given him. He'd started a new business, honest work. He'd found a woman to marry, a widow, kind, who didn't judge him for his past. In his letter, he wrote, "I know I can never ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see what you've done. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just accepting your fate, but choosing it. You've become the woman your mother always wanted to be, and I'm proud to be your father." Lydia folded the letter and looked out at the ranch. The snow was melting. Spring was coming. In the distance, she could see Elias working with the ranch hands. But he wasn't shouting orders the way Walter had. He was collaborating, teaching, building something together. The bruise on her cheek had long since faded. Physically, it was gone. But she could still feel it sometimes. Not as pain, but as a reminder. A reminder of the moment she'd decided that she belonged to herself. And Elias? He'd learned to love her that way. Not as property, not as a prize to be claimed, but as a person, an equal, a partner in building a life. For the first time in her entire existence, Lydia Hartwell Kane was truly, completely, entirely her own. And no man, not her father, not Walter, not even Elias, could ever change that.